Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Dust Trail. Today, I want to share with you a story about a woman who thought her life was already finished with her, until one winter proved her wrong. By the winter of her 48th year, Margaret Carter knew how to mend fence, break a mare, and sign a banknote. She knew how to haggle for feed, how to keep the books straight, and how to stare down a banker who thought a woman shouldn't own this much land. What she didn't know anymore was how to let someone stand beside her. The Carter Ranch sat out on the high plains where the wind didn't just blow. It lived. That afternoon, it came crawling over the hills, dragging loose snow with it, wrapping itself around fence posts and whistling through loose boards. Maggie walked that wind-swept yard like she had 1,000 times before, coat buttoned tight, scarf pulled up, boots crunching through frozen ruts. She checked the pump first. The handle was stiff with ice, but the water still groaned up from the earth like an old man getting out of bed. She nodded once, satisfied, then moved on to the horses. They knew her rhythm, knew the sound of her steps. Ears pricked, muzzles reached for her pockets, hoping for a treat she didn't have the heart to give today. She ran a gloved hand down a brown neck anyway. The small, familiar warmth of another living thing. Inside the house, everything was neat. Too neat. Dishes washed and dried. Coffee pot scrubbed. The quilt on her bed pulled so tight, a coin might have bounced off it. No boots kicked off by the door. No half-finished cup of coffee going cold on the table. Just the tick of the clock, and the faint rattle of the window pane every time the wind changed its mind. On the mantel, in a frame that had lost its shine a long time ago, sat a photograph. Her father on one side, jaw set like he was looking into sun. Her husband on the other, younger, eyes softer, hat tipped just enough to say he didn't quite take life as seriously as the older man. Both gone now. One to sickness, one to an accident, out on the west fence that she still saw in her sleep some nights. The town called Maggie Carter stubborn. They said it with a mix of respect and something almost like irritation. Over the years, men had come courting widowers with hungry kids, bachelors with hungry eyes, all of them with a little too much interest in acreage and water rights. She'd turned them down, each and every one. Folks said she was cold, hard, more steel than woman. But if you could have stepped inside her chest, past the careful way she carried herself and the flat tone she used at the feed store, you'd have found something else. Not ice, not stone, just a tired, aching place that remembered what it felt like to lose, and had no interest in trying that lesson a second time. That evening, as the last of the lights slid off the snow, Maggie stood at the front window and looked out across her land. Fences marching away in straight lines, cottonwoods standing bare along the dry creek, and beyond all of it, rising out of the white, like an old memory, was Red Mesa. In summer, it burned rust red against the sky. Today, snow lay along its ridges and shadows filled its cracks, turning it into something softer, quieter, and somehow heavier. Her father used to say, "That mesa made us Carters rich," said it like a blessing, a joke, and a warning all at once. Maggie folded her arms and watched that hunk of red rock until the window frosted around the edges. She would have told you she was just checking the weather, just measuring the storm rolling in. But something else was moving inside her. A small, restless unease she couldn't quite name. The feeling that Red Mesa was watching her back and that this winter, whether she wanted it or not, was going to ask her who she really stood with, her father's papers, or the truth buried under that snow. The next morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of winter day that looked gentle from the window and cut like a knife once you stepped outside. Maggie hitched up the wagon anyway. Flour was low. Coffee was almost gone. And she'd promised herself quietly, where no one could hear it, that she'd bring home one small string of Christmas color. Just so the house didn't feel quite so much like a waiting room for ghosts. The road into town was half ice, half frozen ruts. Her breath fogged the air as she drove, gloved hands steady on the reins. The closer she got to town, the more the sounds changed. The lonely whistle of the wind giving way to the clatter of wagons, the bark of dogs, and the faint, tinny notes of a piano leaking from the saloon. In the general store, the air was warm and full of smells that made her heart twist: coffee, leather, tobacco, peppermint. She kept her list short and precise: flour, beans, salt, lamp oil. Nothing on that page said she was lonely. Nothing said she woke up some nights reaching for a man who wasn't there. By the counter, a little display of Christmas goods leaned wearily against the wall: a chipped music box, a handful of bright glass ornaments, and a string of red paper bells folded flat. Maggie's fingers touched the bells before she could stop herself. They crackled softly, waiting to be opened. "Dressin' up the ranch this year, Miss Carter?" the storekeeper asked, half teasing, half hopeful. "For the house," she said. "Too quickly. Makes it less dark in the evenings. That's all." She added the bells to her pile and pretended not to see the knowing look that passed between the two women at the counter. Outside, talk drifted up and down the street like wood smoke. "Surveyors'll be here come spring. Mark my words. Railroad's gonna change everything. You either get ahead of it or get run over." Near the hitching rail, Clayton Briggs held court, boots planted wide, thumbs hooked in his vest. His voice carried, the way loud men's voices always did. "Briggs and Carter land. That's where the line ought to run," he was saying. "Straight shot past Red Mesa. Solid ground. Easy grading. We fast-track this right. We'll be sittin' pretty, while the rest of you are still beggin' for sidings and spur lines." Someone asked if Maggie knew about this plan. Clayton laughed. "She'll know when the money shows up. Same as the rest of us. Unless she's too proud to take it." "Which wouldn't surprise me." Maggie heard him. Of course, she did. But she'd long ago learned the power of pretending not to. She kept her chin level, loaded her supplies into the wagon, and climbed up without looking his way. The sky had changed while she shopped. The clear blue morning had gone flat and gray, like someone had pulled a lid over the world. A line of darker cloud sat heavy on the horizon, moving faster than she liked. She clicked to the team, setting them toward home. By the time she left town behind, the first flakes were already falling, light at first, just a dusting that melted on her coat, then thicker, fatter, sticking to the horses' manes and the wagon seat. The wind picked up, turning playful at first, then impatient. The road blurred at the edges as the fields and fences disappeared into white. She hunched into her collar and spoke to the horses under her breath. "Keep on, boys. We've done worse than this." Miles later, the light was fading faster than it should have. Snow came sideways now, biting at the thin skin between scarf and hat. The familiar landmarks, the lone cottonwood, the split boulder, The low dip in the land that meant home was closer, grew strange and ghostly. On the narrow stretch near the tree line, where the road pinched between rock and a stand of dark pines, the wagon jolted to a sudden stop. The horses snorted and shied, eyes rolling white. A dead cottonwood had come down across the trail, snow piling against its limbs. One more gift from a season that didn't care one bit who owned the land it fell on. Easy, Maggie barked, hauling back on the reins as the nearer horse danced sideways. The wagon rocked. Her boots slipped on the packed snow as she swung down, landing hard enough to send a shard of pain up her ankle. She barely had time to take 2 steps toward the fallen tree before a shape separated itself from the dusk under the pines. A man. He moved with the snow, not against it. A long, lean shadow wrapped in a wool coat and an old cavalry blanket. His hair, dark, with streaks of gray, brushed his shoulders. His face was lined, not from softness, but from time in the wind. Apache features, strong and unmistakable. Her hand went for the small revolver under her coat out of habit, fingers closing on cold metal. He was faster, not reckless, not wild, just fast in a way that said he'd spent a lifetime reading danger and meeting it head-on. One gloved hand caught the bridle of the nearest horse, bringing the animal back under control, with a quiet word in a language she didn't know. The other stayed away from his belt, away from any weapon, open and visible. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice low, accented but clear. "We don't have time to argue. The storm will kill you out here." She bristled at the sound of her own name in his mouth. "You don't know a damn thing about what I have time for. Get your hand off my horse." The wind clawed at them, flinging snow into her eyes, her mouth. The horses danced again, fighting the bit. The dead tree loomed ahead, the woods hemming them in on both sides. Somewhere above them, the sky let loose. Another gust that felt like an open-handed blow. He didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer than he had to. The road's gone in half a mile. The drifts are already chest-high in the draws. You push on, you'll be walking blind in an hour. And then you'll lie down. Folks always lie down. I've ridden this trail since I was a girl." She snapped, blinking ice from her lashes. "Get out of my way." She pulled the revolver free this time. His eyes flicked to it, then back to her face. There was no fear there, only a grim kind of patience. "I watched that storm walk across the mesa," he said. "It's not the kind you argue with." The horses chose that moment to panic in earnest. A crack of thunder rolled somewhere far off. Or maybe it was just the sound of the wind tearing through the treetops. One animal lunged sideways. The other tried to back up. The wagon slewed, skidding on the ice. Maggie turned to grab the reins, boots slipping on snow-slick ground. The world tilted. For a heartbeat she saw nothing but a whirl of white and dark and the flash of the man's blanket as he moved. Then her heel caught on frozen earth, and her head met it with a sickening, hollow thud. The sky went out like a lamp. Her last dim sense was of strong arms catching her, stopping her from sliding under the horse's hooves. She felt herself lifted, cradled against a chest that smelled of smoke and pine and cold wool. A low voice said something she didn't understand. Words carried away by the storm. Snow closed in, thick and relentless, covering tracks, branches, and the narrow, lonely woman who'd thought she could outrun winter by sheer force of will. When Maggie woke, there was no wagon, no horses, no road, only a low, flickering light, and the steady hiss of snow beyond it. She lay on a bed of pine boughs under a rock overhang, the stone above her stained with old smoke. A small fire burned close to the opening, throwing orange light across the rough walls. Her head pulsed with a dull ache, and when she tried to move her right foot, an answering pain flared up her ankle. A figure crouched by the fire, feeding it a careful stick at a time. When he turned, she recognized him, the man from the trail, Apache. Lines of age and hard miles softened by the glow of the flames. Her hand flew to her coat, searching for the revolver. It wasn't there. Lookin' for this. His voice came from the shadows beside her. He held the gun up between two fingers, then set it on a flat rock within reach. But turned toward her. You passed out, he said. Hit your head on the road. I brought you down out of the wind. She pushed herself up on her elbows, teeth clenched. You kidnapped me. A corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. I kept you from freezing in a ditch. Kidnapping sounds worse on the church steps. I suppose. Take me back to my ranch, she said, ignoring the way the firelight swam in front of her eyes. Now, he studied her without speaking, eyes dark and steady. Then he nodded toward her wrapped ankle. You stand on that in this snow. You won't get 10 steps. We ride in the morning. If the drifts let us. The overhang opened toward a narrow cut in the canyon. Beyond it, the storm still raged. Wind, shoving curtains of snow past the entrance. The world outside was a white wall. She knew storms. She knew when a man was lying about them. He wasn't. It only made her angrier. Why are you here? She demanded. Why me? He moved closer to the fire, hands extended to the heat, palms scarred. I watched that storm roll off Red Mesa before sunup. Knew somebody'd be foolish enough to test it. When I saw your wagon, I hoped I was wrong. That doesn't answer my question. He was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing how much to say. Finally, he spoke, each word measured. My name is Jolan Redbird. Nday, this canyon, that ridge you stare at from your window, they were ours before your father ever signed a paper with a banker's pen. She stiffened. My father bought this land fair and square. He looked at her then. Really looked. Like a man checking the sky for a break in the clouds. Your father signed deeds that stretched Carter lines farther than any measure your grandfather ever claimed. Far enough to lay claim to Red Mesa. He said the name differently, in his own language. And it sounded older. It's just a hill, she said. But the words felt thin. Even to her, his gaze shifted to the mouth of the overhang, to where the storm hid the world. It's a burial ground. My grandfather's bones are there. My little brothers. Others. Before them. The railroad men have already pounded stakes into the slope. They are talking about blasting rock come spring. A week ago, I found pieces of a skull in the snow. The fire popped, sending a brief spray of sparks up toward the low roof. Maggie swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. You think I knew that? She whispered. I think you didn't care to know. There was no heat in his voice. Just a flat, worn-out kind of truth. I went first to the land office, then to the sheriff. They said the same thing. Redbird. Take it up with the Carters. With Pontabast. He turned back to her. So here I am. Maggie felt the weight of her own name like a stone on her tongue. Carter. A word that had opened doors and bought time at the bank, and given her a roof when other women ended up in town boarding houses. A word that now stood between this man and his dead. My father may have been hard, she said. The old, automatic defense rising up from habit. But he wasn't a thief. The lines at the corners of Jolan's eyes deepened. Not in anger, but in something sadder. Sometimes, he answered quietly. The stealing starts with a pen, not a gun. His words hung in the close, smoky air. Outside, the wind howled down the canyon, dragging more snow in its teeth, erasing tracks, blurring boundaries. Maggie lay back against the rough blanket, head pounding in time with her heartbeat. And for the first time since she'd taken over the ranch, she wasn't sure exactly where her land ended, or where the truth began. The storm did not ease. It sharpened. Wind came hurtling down the canyon like it had a personal grievance, shoving snow into every crack in the rock. The little fire under the overhang hissed and shivered, its thin line of smoke yanked sideways before it could rise. Outside that shallow cave, the world had shrunk to white and howling. Inside, it was all flicker and shadows and the close, rough sound of two people learning each other in fits and starts. Jolan checked Maggie's ankle without asking permission, but not without respect. His hands were steady and careful, fingers warm even through the cloth, as he tested the swelling. She hissed once when he pressed too near the bone. He murmured something in his own tongue, almost an apology, then wrapped it again with a strip of clean linen, pulled from his pack. "You walk on this tonight," he said, tying off the knot. "You'll tear what the fall only bruised." She wanted to snap at him, to tell him she'd been walking hurt on this land longer than he'd been watching its storms. But the throbbing in her ankle had its own voice. And for once, she listened. She let her back slide against the rock until she was sitting again. Breath, leaving her in a long, reluctant sigh. He shrugged out of the thin coat he wore and settled it around her shoulders before she could protest. The cavalry blanket stayed on him, threadbare in places, but dense with old smoke and weather. "You'll freeze," she said. He poured something dark from a battered tin pot into a dented cup. The scent of burnt coffee and metal filled the little space. "I've been colder," he answered, handing the cup to her. "Drink. It helps the head." Maggie wrapped her hands around the tin, letting the heat bite into her palms. The first sip was bitter and strong enough to make her eyes water, but it put some fire back into the hollow behind her ribs. For a while, they sat like that, the storm shouting outside and the fire answering in its small, steady way. When they did speak, it was in short bursts, like people testing ice on a river, one foot down, then another, seeing what would hold. He asked about the ranch, in a simple, blunt way, not the circling curiosity of town gossip. "How long since you took it over?" 5 years as my name on the papers. "Longer doing the work?" Her fingers flexed on the cup. "My father held on as long as he could. Wouldn't let go until he couldn't walk the fence himself." "And your husband?" he asked. She looked into the fire as if his face were there. 3 winters before that, West Fence gave way in a thaw. He went out in the dark to shore it up. Ground took him down with it. They say his neck broke fast, that he didn't suffer. Her mouth twitched. People are always so sure about other folks' pain. Jolan didn't offer the usual phrases, "No, I'm sorry." "No, that's God's will." He just nodded once, the way a man might acknowledge a hard trail someone else had walked. "Your father?" she asked after a while, driven by some crooked sense of fairness. "And your family?" His eyes shifted to the canyon mouth. Beyond it, the wind howled, as if it knew its cue. "My mother went with the coughing sickness. long before your army learned my name," he said. "My father died slow, at a fort that promised him protection and gave him rations full of mold. My grandfather and my brother are on that mesa you look at from your window." He said it as if he were listing supplies. Not wounds. No drama. No begging for understanding. "When I was young," he went on after a time, "I scouted for your officers, rode ahead to read the land, find water, watch other bands. They paid me in coin and powder and promises. Then the war changed and the uniforms changed. And one morning, the man in the blue coat said, 'We don't need your kind anymore.' Redbird. Just like that." He shook his head. A small, tired motion. "The land didn't change when they said it. Only the way they looked at me did." Maggie listened. The coffee cooling in her hands, the firelight cut into the lines of his face, made them deeper. But it also caught something else: patience. Maybe. Or the stubbornness of someone who had been told no by men with guns, and decided to keep breathing anyway. "The ranch is quiet now," she admitted. "Too quiet. Used to be I could hear my father's boots on the floorboards, my husband's laugh in the next room. Now it's just the clock and the coyotes. At night, it feels like the walls are waiting for someone who isn't coming." He glanced over at her. "And still you turned away every man who offered to fill that space." She bristled. "Most of them wanted my water, my pasture, or a warm body to cook for them until their hearts quit. They weren't offering to share the weight, just to sit in the big chair and call themselves fortunate." He seemed to consider that, then nodded as if something had been confirmed. "You were right to send them away. You don't know a thing about it. I know what it is to have something taken because someone decides they're owed it," he said. "Land. Name. The woman doesn't matter the shape. Stealing is stealing." The way he said woman made heat crawl up the back of her neck. Not from shame, but from a slow, startled awareness. Here, in the middle of a canyon, with snow piling up outside, with her ankle throbbing and her hair a mess under her scarf, this man saw her not as a problem to fix or property to claim, but as someone whose choices made sense. They fell quiet again. The wind rattled along the rock, searching for a way in. The fire began to sink. Jolin fed it a new piece of wood with automatic care. Hands. Sure. Movements efficient. He checked her ankle once more. More with his eyes than his fingers. Then retreated to the edge of the overhang, sitting with his back to the stone, face turned toward the storm. "You should sleep," he told her. "Head needs rest." "And you?" she asked. He lifted one shoulder. "Someone should watch the fire and listen for what walks on the snow." "You think something's coming?" she challenged. He met her gaze. "Things always come. Might be a drift trying to smother the entrance. Might be coyotes sniffing for warmth. Might be a man who thinks night is the best time for killing. I've lived too long not to listen." She wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need guarding, hadn't needed it in years. But the truth was, there was a part of her that hadn't felt this, eased, in longer than she cared to admit. To have someone else awake, someone else taking the first measure of the dark. The cramp of pain in her head dulled a little. The warmth of the fire and the weight of the coat around her shoulders did their work. Her eyes grew heavier with each breath. Through the blur of sleep, she saw him as the flames sketched him, broad shoulders under the blanket, hair loose around his face, eyes steady and open, a sentinel carved out of shadow and embers. Outside, snow kept falling. erasing the world 1 inch at a time. Maggie Carter, who had spent years teaching herself to rest, with one ear open for every creak of her empty house, let her eyes close all the way. The last thing she knew was the soft crackle of the fire and the sure knowledge that if anything came crawling out of that storm, it would meet Jolon Redbird before it ever got to her. Morning, when it finally arrived, came in muted and shy. The world beyond the canyon mouth was no longer rage and motion, but a deep, smothered stillness. Snow lay thick and perfect over every line and hollow, as if the land had taken a long, slow breath and forgotten how to let it out. They left as soon as the sky lightened enough to see. Jolon helped her onto the horse with a grip that was firm, without being presumptuous. He walked beside her, instead of riding, one hand on the bridle, the other free. Each step was a measured push through drifts that reached nearly to his knees. The ranch, when it finally appeared over the rise, looked smaller under all that white. Chimney smoking. Barn roof bowed slightly under the weight. Fences turned into half-buried lines of shadow. For a heartbeat, Maggie felt an unexpected rush of relief. Home. Her land. Her rules. Then she saw the horses, 4 of them, tied off by the porch. Men were clustered near the front steps, breath pluming the air. One figure stood apart, hat brim low, coat longer and darker than the rest. Sheriff Wade Hollis. Beside him, Clayton Briggs, easy to recognize. The big gestures, the sharp tilt of his head, like he was always tracking someone weaker than him. Jolon's hand on the bridle tightened almost imperceptibly. Maggie felt her stomach drop. The quiet of the canyon replaced by a different kind of storm. Word traveled faster than snow. By the time they were close enough to hear voices, Sheriff Hollis's hand had settled on the butt of his pistol. The other men, 2 deputies and Briggs, spread out behind him. An unspoken wall. There. Briggs barked, pointing like he'd treat a fox. Told you he'd bring her back once he was done. Apache don't finish a job proper. Should have ridden after them last night. Maggie felt heat crawl up her spine. Done. As if she were a chore. A task. Some ugly errand completed. Sheriff Hollis raised his voice. Eyes trained on Jolon. Dismount and step away from the lady. Slow now. Hands where we can see him. Jolon stopped but didn't drop the bridle immediately. His gaze flicked up to Maggie. Then back to the lawman. I brought her home, he said. She fell. Hit her head. Storm would have taken her if I hadn't. Briggs snorted. You expect us to swallow that? You dragged her off that trail, same as your lot, has been dragging off cattle for years. Maggie's temper, which had slept under grief for too long, snapped awake with a clarity that surprised her. She swung her leg over and half slid, half fell out of the saddle before Jolon could reach up to steady her. Pain flared in her ankle, but she rode it like she'd ridden worse. Standing between Jolon and the rifles came as natural as breathing. Sheriff, she said, loud enough to cut across Briggs's next insult. If you're fixing to draw on anyone this morning, you might want to think real careful whose side of this story you're on. Wade Hollis was not a bad man, just a tired one. Lines of sleepless nights bracketed his mouth. He'd known Maggie since she was a girl running wild along the creek. He'd also seen too many dead bodies laid out under sheets, white and red alike. Miss Carter, he began, cautious. Half of town says an Apache took you. Your wagon came back with no one in it. Hard thing to ignore. Half of town wasn't there. She shot back. I hit my head when my horse spooked at a downed tree. woke up in a rock shelter instead of frozen stiff by the road. Because this man, she jerked her chin toward Jolin, carried me out of the storm. Briggs spit in the snow. That what he told you? You're too smart to be that foolish. Maggie, he's trespassed on white land for months. This is just one more line crossed. Jolin's jaw flexed. But he stayed where he was. Hands open, the butt of his knife, and the strap of his rifle untouched. His control, under the weight of all that suspicion, was its own kind of statement. Maggie turned on Clayton Briggs with a look that had stopped bank managers mid-sentence. You call this trespass? Dragging a woman out of a blizzard, tell me. Clayton, how many miles would you walk through snow to make sure I saw my front door again? His mouth opened, then shut. Color rose up his neck. She faced the sheriff again. The men behind him shifted in their saddles. Uneasy. He saved my life, she said, each word hammered out like a nail. Any mark on me came from the fall, not his hands. You haul him in on a charge after that. You're saying a man can't so much as keep a widow from freezing without waking up in irons. Hollis's fingers eased minutely on the gun. He looked from Maggie to Jolin, to Briggs, and back again, the equation playing out in his head. There's still the matter of him being where some folks don't want him. He tried. Maggie stepped closer to Jolin until the edge of her coat brushed his blanket. It was a small, deliberate act, but it might as well have been a shot fired in the cold morning air. If you lock him up, Sheriff, she said smoothly, you'd better make room for me, because I'll be sitting in the next cell, telling every soul in this county how you jail the man who carried me out of a blizzard while certain other men stood by warm stoves and ran their mouths. That landed. Even the deputies winced a little. Hollis rubbed a hand over his jaw, breath misting in the air. Damn it, Maggie, he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Then, louder. All right. Nobody's going in today. Not you. Redbird. Not you. Either. Clayton. Though you're testin' my patience. Briggs exploded. You can't be serious. I said enough. There was iron in the sheriff's voice now. I'm not throwing a man in a cell for walking a widow home through a storm. We'll sort out the rest another way. He turned a hard eye on Jolin. You stay off Carterland till then. I don't need more trouble than I've already got. Jolin inclined his head. A small bow stripped of any servility. I hear you. He started to turn away, boots creaking in the snow. Something in Maggie recoiled at the sight of his back moving off across her yard, like he was some hired hand, dismissed without pay. Jolin, she called, before she'd fully decided what to say. He paused. She limped forward 2 steps. You came through a night most men wouldn't have tested. You carried me. And you faced down guns that weren't aimed at you for anything you'd done wrong. Her voice softened just a fraction. You're not walking out of here hungry. She nodded toward the bunkhouse, its door half buried in drift. There's stew on the stove and a bed in there that hasn't seen a back in 3 years. You sit. You eat. You rest. Then you can decide how much more of Carterland you're willing to walk off. For a heartbeat. No one moved. The air between them was thick with surprise. Hers. His. And the men still on their horses. Briggs gave a disgusted noise and yanked his reins. This isn't the end. Maggie, he snapped, wheeling his horse around. You'll regret throwing in with him. She watched him go with eyes gone hard as flint. Maybe he was right. Maybe trouble was circling, drawing tighter and tighter rings around her life. But as Jolin Redbird met her gaze with that calm, measuring look, and as the smell of her own cooking drifted faintly from the bunkhouse, Maggie Carter felt something else stir beneath the worry. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone in her own yard, and whatever was coming next, she had a feeling this winter wasn't finished, changing the shape of her world. Red Mesa had lived at the edge of Maggie's vision her whole life. A red shoulder of land watching the Carter place from a distance. It was one thing to stare at it through a frosted window with a cup of coffee in her hand. It was another to ride straight toward it, knowing what lay under that skin of rock and snow. The storm had cleared to a brittle blue by the time she saddled up again. Her ankle ached in the stirrup, but she ignored it. Jolon rode beside her, quiet as ever, guiding them around drifts and along the firmer edges of the trail. The air was so cold it felt clean, as if the night's rage had scraped everything raw. They didn't talk much. Words felt too small for what they were riding toward. The closer they came, the more the snow itself seemed to change, picking up a faint pink cast from the stone beneath. Red Mesa rose up from the plain like an old, sleeping animal, its flanks layered and ridged, each line a story she'd never learned. They left the horses at the base where the slope grew steep and climbed the rest on foot. Maggie's breath came shorter, not from the climb alone, but from the tightness gathering under her ribs. Her boots slipped once in the loose snow over rock, and Jolon's hand was just there, not grabbing, just offering. She used it without thinking, then let go just as quick. At the top, the world seemed to fall away around them. The land rolled out in every direction, white broken by dark tree lines, and the thin, straight scars of fences. The Carter house was a toy far off. The creek, a gray thread. For a moment it was almost beautiful. Then she saw the ground at her feet. There were wooden markers scattered along the ridge, some no more than splinters, pushed at odd angles out of the snow. A few still held shapes across. A carved circle, lines cut by a careful hand long ago. Between them, the earth had been torn open in harsh, straight bites. Surveyor holes, fresh dirt, rose in raw. Ugly mounds where drills had chewed into the hillside. Snow lay over them in uneven patches, unable to soften what had been done. Here and there, pale shards pushed through stone. She thought at first, until one of them caught the light in a way rock doesn't. She stepped closer, throat tightening. The fragment was small and curved, smoother than any stone, and a color she recognized in the deepest part of herself, the color of what lay under skin. Someone had nudged snow over it clumsily, as if trying to hide a wound. Maggie's stomach rolled. The air seemed to thin out. For a heartbeat she imagined her father's hand, sure and steady, signing his name on crisp paper in the land office. She saw the ink drying, heard the county clerk calling it a proud day for the Carters. She wanted to be sick. Jolon moved among the mounds like a man walking through a church. His boots made barely a sound. He stopped by one marker, then another, touching them lightly with the tips of his fingers. "My grandfather," he said, nodding toward a weathered post, carved with a sunburst pattern. He told stories so long. Some nights, the fire burned down to nothing while we listened. Said the land remembered every footstep laid on it, even when people forgot. His gaze slid to the drilled holes. "I wonder what it remembers of this." He walked on, stopping near a smaller hump, set close to the larger one, as if a child had gone to sleep beside his elder and never woken. His voice softened, though the words stayed plain. "My brother. He was 7. Fever took him quick. We rode to the fort for the doctor. They made us wait outside the gate until morning. Said the captain was asleep. By the time they let him in, there was nothing to save. He reached down, brushing snow from a simple marker worn almost smooth. We put him here. My grandfather said the hill would watch over him. The wind tugged at Maggie's coat, found its way under the edges. She wrapped her arms around herself, not against the cold, but against the shame rising hot in her face. The ridge blurred for a second. She blinked hard, angry at herself for letting tears into this place. My father never. Her voice came out thin. She cleared it. Tried again. He never spoke of this. Of any of this. He talked about Red Mesa like it was a prize goat, or a good harvest. Something that came to us because we'd earned it. Jolin turned to look at her fully. Eyes dark and sober. Your father talked to men in rooms with stoves and lamps. Men with maps, who call everything by numbers. When someone like me stood in their doorway, they saw trouble, not truth. She flinched. Not because he raised his voice, he hadn't, but because every word found its mark. I didn't know, she whispered. God help me. I didn't know. He didn't rush to comfort her. Didn't let her off the hook. You didn't ask, he said. And there was no cruelty in it. Just that same worn-out honesty. You looked at this ridge and saw money and a name. I looked at it and saw my people lying still. Both things can't live on the same ground without one of them being hurt. Silence stretched out between them, filled with wind and the faint, distant creak of branches far below. Maggie looked down at her gloved hands, then out at the fields beyond, at the fences and the lines, and all the ways her life had been drawn. When she spoke, her voice shook, but it didn't break. If my name put your dead in danger, she said slowly, then my name is going to be what makes it right. Jolon watched her, saying nothing. I will go to the land office, she went on. To Hollis. To those railroad men snapping their braces down at the saloon. I will put my own hand on the Bible and say this ridge was never ours to take. I'll give up every acre they tacked on if I have to. He studied her face like a man reading sky signs, searching for a lie, a weakness, the way he might read a horizon for dust clouds from riders coming in hard. Whatever he saw there, it seemed to shift something in him. The set of his shoulders eased by a fraction. You speak that way in front of them, he said. They'll call you a fool. Or worse, I've been called stubborn, cold, difficult. Her mouth tilted. Fool will just round out the collection. For a moment, something like a smile softened his features. It wasn't much, but it was real. He nodded once. Not a gracious bow. Not a sweeping thanks. Just a single, heavy acknowledgement that carried more weight than a dozen speeches. All right, he said. We'll do it your way first. The next days folded into each other like pages pressed tight. Snow settled deeper over the ranch, turning chores into something that fought back. Jolin moved through it with a quiet efficiency that made Maggie both grateful and a little angry at herself for needing it. He shored up the sagging stretch of fence along the south pasture, shoulders working beneath his coat as he drove posts into half-frozen ground. He chopped wood with the easy rhythm of a man who'd been splitting logs since before he could shave, stacking neat rows under the lean-to until the pile looked like a small wall against the cold. Maggie found herself cooking more, without quite deciding to. At first it was just practicality, if there was another pair of hands working her land. They needed feeding. But the first evening, she set 2 bowls on the table instead of 1. The air in the kitchen shifted. Awkward, at first. Conversation catching and starting. Spoons clinking a little too loud. The second night, it felt less like a mistake and more like habit. They burned a batch of biscuits on the third day. Maggie cursed softly and went to pitch them out for the chickens. Jolan caught one, bit into the corner, and grunted, "Still better than army bread," he said. She laughed then. An honest burst that startled both of them. It hung in the warm, steamy air, making the lamplight seem brighter. Sometimes they worked in silence, passing tools back and forth without needing to name them. Other times, small conversations unfolded about the price of hay, about the way coyotes learned to leap higher when fence lines grew slack, about the strange, hollow feeling of hearing your own house settle at night and knowing no one else heard it with you. Sheriff Wade Hollis came by on the fourth day, his horse blowing steam in the cold. He stomped snow off his boots and took off his hat inside, turning it in his hands like a man turning over a difficult thought. "I've been hearin' talk," he said without preamble, "about you two up on Red Mesa. About you, Maggie. Sayin', you mean to give up claim on that ridge?" She met his eyes. "You heard right," he sighed. "Long and tired. You realize what you're doin'. You take a hammer to your own foundation like that. You're not just crackin' the Carter name. You're hittin' your father's memory, the way folks have seen him for years. You're cuttin' down the value of your land in the same breath. Bankiers, they may start sniffin' around for weaknesses." Maggie folded her arms. "My father's memory doesn't need a lie proppin' it up. And I'd sooner live on half the land honest than all of it on someone else's bones." Hollis looked at Jolan then, jaw working. "This is the road you wanted her on." Jolan shook his head once. "I wanted my grandfather to sleep." The road chose itself when they drove their stakes into his grave. The sheriff scrubbed a hand over his face. "County meetin's in 3 days. Railroad man will be there. Land clerk too. You say your piece then. In front of everyone. There's no taking it back. That's the point," Maggie said. He nodded slowly, as if something inevitable had slid into place. "All right. Then, just be ready. People don't like their world rearranged, even for the better." That night, after the sheriff rode off and the chores were done, Maggie lit the big lamp on the kitchen table and fetched the tin box from its place under the bed. Old deeds lay inside, crisp at the edges, smelling faintly of ink and dust. Her father's strong, slanted signature marched across them, each letter certain. Unapologetic, she spread the papers out beside a crude map of the valley Jolan had drawn on brown wrapping paper. His finger traced a line along the creek, over the low ridge, up to Red Mesa, not the way the clerk's map showed it, with straight borders like a checkerboard, but the way he remembered walking it as a boy, before anyone had called it Carter Land. Their heads bent close over the table, lamplight circling them in a warm halo. At one point, her hand slid under his as they both reached to steady the same corner of the paper. They froze, that point of contact sparking a jolt that had nothing to do with static and everything to do with blood, waking up in places it had gone to sleep. Maggie pulled back first, heart thudding a little too fast. Jolan didn't press the moment. He just looked at her with that steady, questioning gaze, as if offering her the choice to step closer or step away. The narrator might have said, if there'd been one in the room, that Maggie had worn a ring once, slept beside a man who shared her roof and her winters. She'd known the comfort of another body in the bed, another voice in the dark. But somewhere between grief and survival, between signing banknotes and mending fences alone, she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone simply stand with her, without asking for anything but the truth. By the time the lamp oil ran low, the papers were stacked in a new order, map rolled and tied with string. The decision was made, spoken aloud and written down in ink and in the lines of their faces. In 3 days, they would ride into town together, whatever waited in that meeting hall, the anger, the whispers, the cost. It would meet them side by side. The town hall was never meant for judgment. It was meant for potlucks and harvest dances, for election days and quilting bees. But on that hard winter afternoon, with lanterns swinging from the rafters and snow tapping the windows like impatient fingers, it became a different kind of place. Maggie sat on a straight-backed chair near the front, papers folded in her gloved hands. Jolan stood a half-step behind her shoulder, not hiding, not looming, just there. Sheriff Hollis leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Clayton Briggs prowled near the front like a dog that had caught the scent of blood. And by the stove, warming his fine boots, the railroad man watched it all, with the bored sharpness of someone who measured the world in miles and dollars. It didn't take long for Briggs to move in. "So, this is what we've come to," he boomed, sweeping an arm toward Jolan. "Letting a known troublemaker stand in our hall and pretend he's just here to talk." His mouth curled. "That ridge he claims is holy. Just rocks. Same as any other. We've all done what needed doin' to tame this land. Carter's most of all." He let that hang. A sweet, poisonous little hint that the Carter fortune hadn't been entirely clean. "The railroad's our future," Briggs went on. "Progress doesn't wait for ghosts and stories." The railroad agent cleared his throat, voice smooth and clipped. "Gentlemen, ladies, the company isn't here to step on anyone's traditions." His tone suggested he didn't much care if they did. "We are, however, very interested in avoiding delays. If these burial questions," he barely bothered to hide the skepticism, "turn into lawsuits, we'll reroute, likely across land that brings in the least return, unless the county can handle things quietly." That word quiet told everyone in the room exactly what kind of handling he preferred. Maggie felt every eye slide toward her. Carter land, Carter name, Carter Ridge. The papers in her hands were suddenly heavy as stone. She stood, legs a little unsteady, but her chin level, when she spoke. Her voice was hoarse at first, then steadied with use. "My father's deeds," she said, stretched farther than any fair measure. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. She kept going. He knew Red Mesa was sacred ground to the Apache before he signed for it. He knew there were graves there. He took it anyway. The room hissed like someone had thrown water on hot iron. Gasps, sharp whispers, the scrape of boots. A rancher near the back shook his head. "Your Carter blood," he called. "You talk like that. You're betraying your own." Maggie took that like a slap and didn't flinch. "I'm not betraying my blood," she said. "I'm refusing to build the rest of my life on top of someone else's dead." She unfolded the papers with hands that trembled but did not drop. "I'm here to relinquish every legal claim I have on Red Mesa. Every inch my family took that doesn't belong to us. I'm giving it back." Briggs stepped forward, outrage turning his face the color of bad meat. "You do this, Maggie, and you're not just cutting your own throat. You're putting a knife to every deed in this room. If her land can be questioned," he snarled, sweeping an arm toward the crowd, Anyone's can. The murmur swelled. Panic and anger mixing like two bad winds. Sheriff Hollis pushed off from the wall, surprising even himself with the force in his step. That's enough. Clayton, Briggs spun on him. You gonna stand there and let her burn down her own house? Let him. He jabbed a finger at Jolon. Drag us all into his grievances. Hollis's jaw worked. I rode up that ridge last week, he said, voice carrying to the rafters. I saw holes drilled where no man had a right to drill. I saw wood markers kicked over. And I saw a piece of bone that didn't come from any cow. The hall went quiet. The kind of quiet that means nobody's breathing too deep. I've worn this badge a long time. He went on. Long enough to know the law's been used to prop up more than one lie in this county. Maybe it's time it started making room for the truth. Even when it rides in late. He nodded toward Maggie. She wants to give up what never should have been hers. That's not tearing down the law. That's finally asking it to stand on something solid. Then it was Jolon's turn. He didn't move to the front. He didn't pound the table or raise his voice. He simply stepped far enough into the center that everyone could see him, and spoke like a man talking to the sky as much as to the room. I'm not here to tear up your maps, he said. I'm not here for your houses or your cattle or your water. I'm here for the hill where my grandfather and my brother are sleeping. He let that sit. Then continued. I'm asking for two things. No more. He held up two fingers, steady as stone. First, you mark Red Mesa as burial ground on your records. Protected. No blasting. No digging. Second, you let my people come to tend our dead, without guns, meeting us on the trail. He looked around. Meeting eyes. Not avoiding a single one. You keep the rest. Every acre of it. I'm not trying to take your future. I'm trying to keep you from grinding our past into gravel. There was a long moment where the only sound was the wind whirring the windows and the creak of the stove cooling. The land clerk, pale and sweating, licked his lips. If Mrs. Carter signs a release, he stammered, fingers fluttering over his ledger. We can amend the deed, remove Red Mesa from Carter property, record it as protected burial land for the ND people. He swallowed. It'll cause comments cheaper than curses, Hollis said dryly. Write it down. The railroad man watched the room, weighing arguments, the way he weighed grades and bridge costs. At last he snapped his pocket watch shut. If the ridge is off the table, he said, we'll adjust the line. There's other rock to cut that doesn't come with this much feeling. He didn't apologize. Men like him rarely did. But he backed away from the fight. And sometimes that's all you get. Clayton Briggs shoved his chair so hard, it screeched against the floor. You're all mad, he spat, handing the whole valley over to guilt and ghost stories. He glared at Maggie, as if he could undo her words by sheer force. This isn't the end. He stomped out into the snow, dragging a cloud of resentment behind him. But inside that drafty hall, a line on a piece of paper was changed. A deed long spoken of with pride was rewritten with humility. Red Mesa, for the first time in years, belonged back to the people whose bones lay under it. It wasn't perfect. Nothing that tangled up in history and hurt ever is. But it was real. A few weeks later, winter had settled into its quieter, deeper self. Christmas had come and gone in a hush, leaving behind a few fading ribbons, an empty cookie tin, and a handful of new habits that no one quite named. The Carter house was still small and weathered, but it no longer felt like a museum. There were two coats hanging by the door, Now one worn canvas, one dark wool. 2 coffee cups stood on the shelf above the stove, both used every morning. A woven Apache blanket, rich with color and pattern, lay over the back of Maggie's favorite chair, as much a part of the room as her father's old rifle on the wall. Maggie and Jolan rode out to Red Mesa together one clear afternoon, when the sky was as sharp and bright as hammered steel. The climb felt different this time. No dread. No question about whose ground they walked on. Up on the ridge, the torn earth had been mended. The drilled holes were filled and smoothed. New markers, set with care. Small handmade tokens rested on the mounds. Feathers bound with leather. Stones carved with circles and lines. Bits of beadwork that caught the light. They stood side by side, looking out over the valley. Carter Land, Briggs Land, Hollis's place tucked by the creek. The railroad survey stakes marking a new path that bent away from the hill like a river respecting a rock it couldn't move. Maggie cleared her throat, the words sticking a little on the way up. "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said quietly. "Never have been. But I am afraid of belonging to someone again. Of losing everything a second time." She let out a breath that smoked in the cold air. "I don't know if I've got it in me." Jalan watched a hawk circle far off, then lowered his eyes back to her face. "I'm not asking you to belong to me," he said. "Not like land or cattle or a horse on a bill of sale." His voice softened. "Sure, in its gentleness. I'm asking if you're willing for us to belong to the same piece of sky. The same winter, the same home." There was no grand gesture, no kiss, written for a stage. Just 2 people, both past the age when the world expects big declarations, standing on a hill that had seen too much, choosing to share whatever years the land and their bones had left. Maggie let that sink in. Let it move through the fear, through the old grief, through the habits of solitude. Then she slid her gloved hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, like they'd been made for that particular work. They walked back down from Red Mesa, hand in hand. 2 figures against snow and red rock, their shadows long on the slope. The wind was still cold. This was winter, after all, but it no longer sounded empty. It sounded like a world that had made a little more room for truth, for rest, for love that didn't flare up fast and burn out, but burned steady and low, the way a good fire should on a long night. Sometimes justice doesn't come with a gunshot or a hanging tree. Sometimes it arrives in the shape of a ranch widow who won't lie to save her pride, and an Apache man who refuses to forget his dead. And somehow, in the middle of all that hurt and history, each becomes the other's second chance at home. My friends, if this story touched something in you, I'd love to hear it. Tell me your thoughts down in the comments, and let me know where in this big world you're listening from tonight. If you'd like more tales from the old trails of courage, love, and hard-earned grace, please remember to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Dust Trail so you don't miss the next ride.